You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, and welcome to this week's SLA Insight. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I want to welcome you. We're continuing a discussion of language output. I've talked about the mental processes involved in producing output. I've talked about the output hypothesis, but now I'm looking at some different ways that output promotes language acquisition. It's often in a refining role, but it does have a role to play in acquisition. A couple of the previous episodes, I've looked at how output promotes depth of learning and how it promotes automaticity. In this episode, I want to look at how output promotes opportunities for interaction. Now, in episode number 8 of SLA Insights, I introduced meaning-focused language instruction. Meaning-focused instruction is the kind of instruction that is deemed best for promoting implicit language knowledge, that is, the intuitive, automatic knowledge of the language. So that seems to be the type of language that's best for really getting at acquisition of the language as opposed to learning about the language. Now, there are two essential ingredients for meaning-focused instruction, and they are input and interaction. Now, I spent a lot of time in this podcast, previous episodes, covering the importance of input, in fact, the essential nature of input and why it's important. But in this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about interaction and why interaction is important for language instruction. And I want you to keep in mind that output is necessary for most forms of interaction. And so, again, this is why output is going to be important for promoting language acquisition. So a little bit about interaction. In the process and challenge of communicating, it's where we get the motivation and the mental workings that promote acquisition. You see, we are social beings. We want to understand and be understood. We want to relate to others, and God has given us language to do just that. So in the process of trying to understand and be understood, again, assuming in the second language that you're learning, it's a very strong motivation for learning the language. And I want you to think about that in contrast to, for example, memorizing a paradigm, where it's abstract words out of context, little or no social interaction unless you have a study buddy, and we're looking at paradigms that have little or no communicative value. They can be done without understanding the meaning of the words, really. And so that form does not have of learning doesn't have the same motivation for learning or the same rewards for learning. So again, I want to quote Van Patten, who says that acquisition is a byproduct of comprehension. And so in that struggle to comprehend, to understand, to be understood, that's where we acquire language. A second advantage of interaction is that it provides opportunities for negotiation of meaning. And I've talked about this before, but just by way of review, during interaction, when communication breaks down, in other words, somebody said something wrong or someone didn't understand what was said, even if it was said correctly, the conversation partners then enter into negotiations. What did you say? What did you mean? I don't understand that word. Can you speak more slowly? And these negotiations encourage the conversation partners to produce output that is comprehensible to the other partner. And so they're working towards comprehension and providing comprehensible input, which again is essential for language acquisition. And this happens in the context of interaction, where you're providing input and output for each other back and forth. So I want you to consider, kind of as an application, two scenarios, and I understand and have intentionally created these scenarios to be polarized. So we're looking at one end of the spectrum versus the other end of the spectrum. So in scenario number one, students are listening passively to a lecture on the grammatical nuances of the perfect. The students go home, sit in isolation, memorize the paradigm, the rules, some vocabulary, and then the students work independently to translate some isolated sentences, generally often out of context. Several days later, they receive feedback from their instructor on their translation. So that's one scenario, again, intentionally polarized. Consider the other end of the spectrum, scenario number two, where the teacher provides a substantial amount of input-based instruction. Now remember that input must precede output. The students have to receive enough input to learn, acquire before they can produce output. There may be some basic instruction on the form of the perfect, but this would be relatively brief. And the instructor's only focusing on one piece of the paradigm, let's say first common singular. Then the students are going to work in pairs in class, interacting, using the perfect, producing output and receiving input from each other, telling each other, for example, what they did last week. I went to the store, I slept, I ate, using the perfect form and describing what they did in an interactive activity. They might also, for example, describe in their own words a story from Scripture, again, using the perfect tense. All the while, as they're working in pairs or small groups, the teacher is walking around, listening, correcting, encouraging. Now, there's several benefits of this approach. One is that it is active learning rather than passive. They're making active use of the new form. And we've talked about that in a previous episode about how using output is active learning. But related to today's topic, interaction, they are interacting in the classroom. It's a social activity which is rewarding in itself, but also contributes to learning as the students are helping each other and learning from each other. And then, as well, in this interactive environment, the struggle for comprehension that leads to acquisition is going on. This is including opportunities for negotiation of meaning as they're struggling to communicate what they want to say, to understand what their partner is saying. It's in that struggle that they're acquiring the language. Now, one other benefit that I haven't talked about from scenario number two is that the students are going to be receiving immediate feedback. First from their other student, their conversation partner, but then also from the teacher who's walking around. The student doesn't have to wait 2 or 3 days or a week for the teacher to grade their paper and get it back to them. They're getting feedback on the spot, which is also going to be more effective as a learning tool. Now, I understand there's going to be some possible objections. One is, doesn't this take a lot of class time? And it can. But can we afford not to encourage deep learning, especially when it can be enjoyable and motivating? Think about how many encounters with the perfect the students are getting in that one class period by interacting with their peers, as opposed to hearing a lecture about it from an instructor where you might get a handful of times, but they're getting repeated exposures in a short amount of time. Now, another possible solution here to class time is that you might consider, especially in our digital age, a flipped classroom where the homework, in this case the interaction, is done in class while the lecture, the teaching, is done at home listening or watching a video that the instructor has prepared for them. So that's looking at one objection. It does take some time, but the benefits are really positive. There's a lot of benefits to it. Second objection, well, what about all the rules? What are we going to do if we don't have a lecture or a textbook reading that gives all the rules and all the uses for the perfect? Well, first of all, you and I don't know all the rules for using our own language, and yet we speak it fluently. Learners learn best when they get just a little bit at a time, followed by practice. So this sort of a interactive classroom is going to have a lot of benefits for deeper learning. But another possible solution here is to consider what's called a spiral syllabus structure. And this is how it works briefly. What you do is you hit on the topic, say it's the perfect, and you hit it lightly the first time around. And then you go on to other topics, and then you return to the first topic, the perfect, a little bit more detail this time. And then you continue hitting the other topics a little bit more and come back around and continue this, again, spiraling, assuming upward, to continue the depth of learning and eventually getting all of the rules in the end. But contrast that with what we might call an information dump, where you learn all the rules all at once. It can be overwhelming for the student, and they're not going to pick up all of them all at once. So providing them with just a few at once, giving them some time to use it, interact, and then hitting it again another day on a deeper level, I think is going to be a stronger way to go. And you will eventually, as you work through the spiral, hit on all the rules. So this, we're going to summarize here ways that output promotes or enables acquisition. And the three that I've promoted so far are ways that output promotes acquisition directly. So first, it promotes deeper language learning when we talked about active versus passive. It helps build automaticity through more encounters and more frequent encounters with the target form. And today, output provides opportunities for interaction, which is, again, promoting acquisition through the struggle to understand and be understood. So this is the third role of output that directly affects acquisition. Next week, I'm going to start talking about ways that output promotes acquisition more indirectly, starting with how output provides more input. So I hope you can join me with that. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.